So for this video's comment section, I would like you to tell me what your favorite scary story was as a child, whether it was a story, a book, a horror movie, anything. If you didn't have one, let me know your relationship to horror as a kid in general. Did you hate being scared? Were you a scaredy cat, but horror still fascinated you? Whatever, I want to know all about it. Enjoy the video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Engagement is what helps this channel out the most, so any form of support is truly appreciated. Thank you. So a dear friend of mine works as the district librarian and media specialist for our local school district, and she's doing an amazing job implementing various activities and programs to help promote literacy and efficient readership among K through 12 students. Particularly, she's been telling me about the various amazing book clubs that she has helped to start for students across all age groups, where students are free to take agency over what they want to read and hold discussions in which they can actually think critically about their reading, about what they're enjoying, etc. But the most peculiar aspect of these book clubs that caught my attention the most, and which was the genesis for the idea behind this video, was a particular kind of book club that she started among 5th graders around the ages of 10 and 11. As she named it, 5th graders were extremely excited to partake in the Scary Book Club, a book club dedicated solely to the reading and discussions of all stories and accounts spooky, creepy, and horrific. My friend explained to me that she wanted to make a book club that catered the joy and importance of reading to this age group specifically, as research shows that this specific age around 3rd to 5th grade is the cutoff point in education in which the majority of children essentially check out of reading because they no longer see it as a valuable, comprehensible, or entertaining thing, thus making this the most crucial of times for children to engage with reading that they find inviting and enjoyable. Urged by this notion, she found herself compelled to make a book club that would be attractive and inviting enough to children of this age group, and thus concluded that a scary book club would be ideal for this task. Now, what fascinated me more than her supposition that children love scary and horrific things was that she was absolutely right, and the children who joined the Scary Book Club have been thoroughly mesmerized and captivated by the spooky stories told and have shown an increased engagement with storytelling and discussions. While, of course, I was delighted to hear that her book club had yielded such positive results, it raised a big question for me, which is of course the title of this video, and which I will attempt to answer from all the angles I possibly can. Why do children love horror? My friend's book club is only a single example of the extensive evidence that shows how much children enjoy and engage with spooky, scary things. If you grew up in the 90s and early 2000s as I did, and you read the title of this video, chances are a particular man's name immediately popped into your head, either that or the title of his most popular series. I'm talking, of course, about R.L. Stine and his children's novel series Goosebumps. Oh, by the way, I just wanted to say I recently came across a channel called Monster Blood, which is all about discussions of various Goosebumps titles, along with reviews, rankings, reading discussions, that kind of thing. I think his videos are great, and he also discusses horror and thrillers in general, and since we're on the subject, I thought I would shout him out. So go ahead and subscribe to him if you're interested. So anyway, as an elementary school student, R.L. Stine seemed to be ubiquitous around school grounds, either lining the shelves of our school library or in the backpacks and hands of fellow students who read work after work by him. Admittedly, I never read a single book by R.L. Stine because back then, I thought he was too scary. And now look what I've become. But I can't say I wasn't endlessly curious about his books and what they were about, and of course I stared at the covers in silence inside of our school library for what seemed like hours, just working up the courage to finally pick up one of his books, which sadly never happened. In even more recent examples, while I don't have children myself, I do have various nieces and nephews, and a good handful of them have often approached me about my own fascination with horror novels and films, which they express great interest in. Even if I have done my best to explain to them that some of this content is not age appropriate for them, that has not deterred them one bit from consuming these stories endlessly. Back in 2017, when the newest adaptation of Stephen King's It hit theaters, there seemed to be this entire subculture of primarily children who created an entire fandom around Pennywise and the Losers Club. And whether it was because the cast of the film was also led by children or because clowns just seemed to call to children no matter what, my youngest niece and nephew were ecstatic about watching the movie, which I ultimately had to take them to see. And they were all about Pennywise. They wanted all these Pennywise like shirts and figures, and even if they didn't sleep for days after watching it, they were in love with the concept. Here I have this portrait my niece painted for me. And if we look past the beautifully constructed alien, we can see that she chose specifically to depict Pennywise and his red balloon because she was just obsessed with the creepy clown. Even further, upon questioning her about the other details, like the mouth going shh and the knife and the epithet go to sleep, she asked me, incredulous, "Oh, you've never heard of Jeff the Killer?" So apparently this is a creepypasta that was super famous years ago. And here I was dumbfounded by the fact that my then 7-year-old niece was not only a connoisseur of creepypastas, but that she downright enjoyed reading them, even if they led to sleepless nights. Another example, this one from one of my nephews, was a horror video game franchise that was insanely popular some years ago titled Five Nights at Freddy's. Which is essentially some kind of nightmarish take on Chuck E. Cheese, I'm not sure, but my nephew was obsessed with playing these games, and even more so with excavating the lore behind it, as he often inundated me with explanations about each character and what their backstory was and all that stuff. So back in those days, walking into a Toys R Us, rest in peace, you would see shelves stacked with these grotesque, horrific creatures, and it was just downright surreal. But kids loved them, and they bought the merchandise compulsively. And speaking much more broadly, I mean, what's a kid's favorite holiday? Maybe Christmas, some weird kids might say Easter, but a good handful of them would say Halloween, which is all about putting on scary costumes and watching scary movies and going around trick-or-treating at night, running around in the dark and scaring each other. All of these examples further cement the validity behind the question posed by this video, that indeed children do love horror, but it only aggrandizes the enigma behind it all. Why? Why all the fascination for horror, grotesquerie, and fear among the young ones? Well, it's not easy, but let's go ahead and see if we can answer the question. Of course, when I say it's not easy to explain why children love horror, what I mean to say is it's not easy for us adults to comprehend it. And by all accounts mentioned, children do not seem that preoccupied with knowing why. They just do. There is a vast separation between the cognitive workings of adults and children, and this, of course, we all pretty much acknowledge as truth. Even if across time and cultures the definitions of childhood have been quite different, perhaps sometimes non-existent, for there indeed was a time when childhood was just not as venerated or sacred as it is today, and children were just little humans who could work and behave much like adults do. But in today's society, and in our pretty much universal understanding of childhood and children, we acknowledge that both entities, adult and child, although sharing the same human makeup, constitute seemingly different worlds. It's especially curious to me that adults feel this way. I mean, children have the excuse that they have never been adults and all they know is childhood, yet every single adult was a child at some point. Of course, as I mentioned, all childhoods are different and all of our brains are different as well, and cultures are quite different about childhood, etc. And you know, some of us just didn't have that enjoyable, typical childhood, and we didn't experience the idyllic experience of being a child. Yet I think it's pretty valid truth to say we were all children in some way or another at some point. However, as adults, we generally feel much more divorced from even our own childhood, almost observing our childhood selves as if they were other beings separate from ourselves.
I hate to say it, I hope I don't sound ridiculous. I don't know who this man is.
Because of this, the answer to this question would be greatly different depending on who you are talking to. Therefore, I have chosen to separate this video into two parts: the adult answer and the child answer as to why children love horror. Adults have, of course, a vastly different way of viewing and explaining childhood than children do. Therefore, their answer will be a more clinical, academic, and psychological view of the subject matter. This means that there is much more literature and many studies on the subject from which to draw evidence, such as from literary criticism, psychological studies, cognitive behavioral studies, etc. However, of course, all of these only lead to theories, proposed explanations, and not entire answers, not the way a child would provide. And while definitive and concise, however, a child's answer might prove unwieldy, mystifying, and difficult for adults to grasp, if they even care to provide one at all. Essentially, in this video, I will lay as much evidence from both sides as I can down and perhaps allow you to maybe come up with an answer or explanation for yourself. As always, discussions are more than encouraged in the comments section. So why don't we go ahead and start with the adult side of things. Adults describing children will most likely use one or both of these words, innocent and vulnerable. Because of this, a more or less universal instinct when it comes to handling children is to try to protect them. In our own constant crusades to preserve innocence in childhood, censorship always proves a powerful tool to try and shield fragile children's eyes from anything obscene, violent, or sexual. These crusades often descend upon mature content, and here horror is often the main target. These instances of moral panic, as Stanley Cohen defined, exist as a condition, episode, or person or group of persons emerging to become defined as a threat to societal values and interests, and its nature is presented in a stylized and stereotypical fashion by the mass media. Children are often at the center of such moral panics, as Lee Edelman observes in his book No Future, Queer Theory and the Death Drive, because children serve as the symbols of our future, the ones who will uphold civilization and continue to reproduce and produce it. And given that they are so innocent and vulnerable, we view it as tantamount to try to protect them from corruption, because it is the best investment we can make towards a safe and healthy future in which they will turn out right. This has led to many legislative and cultural fights in which horror is seen as the main culprit of corruption. Perhaps the most infamous example of such historical instances of moral panic centered around children and horror came from the UK during the 1980s, led by activist Mary Winehouse, who, in an effort to protect the children from the corruptive powers of violence and sex, initiated a campaign that eventually compelled British government to seize and stop all distribution of certain horror titles in video cassette, and to actually prosecute individuals involved in the distribution and production of such obscene titles in a brazen act of censorship. These titles came to be known as video nasties, and were seen as the most corrosive and repulsive thing a child's brain could be subjected to. Save Our Children became quite a common and useful slogan, not just for Mary Winehouse, but for many other activists who used such a universal message of love and care towards children to push their evil agendas of censorship and bigotry. I'm looking at you, Anita Bryant. Oh my god, that clip is like my ASMR. Various other examples, such as the frequently challenged books that are constantly pulled from school libraries to the introduction of parental advisory stickers, etc., make it obvious that the most common wars we wage with children at the center are those of a moral kind, and that scary, horrific things are often the enemy which we must protect our children from. Therefore, the subject of this video is introduced with a kind of moralistic and sensitive taste, given that the reason why children liking horror might seem so odd to us is because it is the opinion of many adults that they should not like it. However, there are many instances, whether conscious or not, in which adults not only allow children to partake and enjoy horror, but in which adults actually push horror onto kids. Crazier still, a lot of these instances are seen as beneficial. Although horror is so constantly contested and disdained as not for children by adults, adults certainly view fear and scaring their children as an extremely useful and didactic tool. I mean, just think, what's the most common fictional character we hear of in stories during our childhood that comes straight from our parents? There's a couple of contenders. There's Santa Claus, although some claim he really is real. Experts remain divided. There's the Tooth Fairy, the Easter Bunny, and among many others, the Boogeyman, and any other cultural variant. For me, growing up, it was El Coco, or he was also named Cucuy, and he's also named Coca in other Latin American regions. Sometimes La Llorona or El Ropavejero served a similar purpose, to basically just scare the shit out of your children so that they will behave and go to sleep. Is it really any wonder at that point that so many children eventually develop a fascination with horror when a lot of parenting focuses on scaring children? In the wise words of Guillermo del Toro,
fear is an incredibly useful feeling to have,
especially when revolving around childhood, which is often the focus of his films. Since the dawn of mankind, and of course among all creatures of this earth, fear serves as a survival tool, a means by which to understand what is dangerous and threatening, and to learn how to stay safe. Most of these lessons are taught to us either by parenting or by experience during our earliest years of childhood. Therefore, it makes sense that one of the most quintessential modes of storytelling to which children are exposed at a young age are cautionary tales meant to scare and instruct. This can most certainly carry on into just a full-on love for scary stories, horror movies, etc. later on in a child's life. It's a very pragmatic approach to the question, but nonetheless, I think it does offer some valuable insight into the lives of children and how they perceive the world, and most importantly, how they are introduced to the world of horror and storytelling by adults. After all, everyone I grew up with knew these same boogeymen and monsters, and they were raised with similar horror stories, and it appears that just being scared is a universal childhood experience, more or less. So there lies a possible answer, that children love horror because adults introduce it as a way of teaching. But beyond all this, there has always existed an adult fixation on just how prominent horror and fear are to a child's life, and how formative scary stories and experiences are for children, not just as cautionary spooky tales, but in a much deeper psychological sense. Indeed, beyond the world of learning and cautioning through horror, many adults have supposed that children are so attached to scary stories because fear and horror are just formative aspects of a child's life. And of course, there was no other figure in history who was so endlessly fascinating with exploring and theorizing about this fixation between horror and childhood than the man, the myth, the legend, the fucking weirdo, Sigmund Freud. Of course, disclaimer, Sigmund Freud is not a valid figure in our modern understanding of psychology and how the brain actually works. Let's just make that clear. Nonetheless, Freud's suppositions are still invaluable and invigorating in the fields of literary and philosophical studies. And given that what we have at hand is a question equally metaphysical as it is psychological, and which brings to questions the cognitive mechanisms behind taste and fixation, a Freudian symptomatic reading might actually prove useful in grappling with a lot of the subtext and significance behind the connection of horror and childhood. At the base of it, the vast majority of Freud's theories revolved around the interpretation and meaning behind dreams and stories. Seeking to understand the cognitive workings of an individual, Freud deduced that logically, the base of all of our mind's workings are settled at the beginning of our lives, and thus viewed childhood as the chaotic genesis of the way we think and behave. Freud viewed these paramount moments of formativeness as results of the conflicts between the id and superego. In simple terms, these are the old animalistic instincts of the mind and their conflict with our poised and civilized behaviors learned through society. Every human, according to Freud, must overcome and sort out these conflicts in childhood, and whatever isn't fully ironed out or resolved re-emerges in adulthood as some kind of trauma or neurosis. Now, I know this is a lot of word vomit to some people, and I understand that, and by all means, I'm not going to attempt a crash course on psychoanalysis on this video, but let's refocus on what this means for childhood, according to Freud. According to his analyses, most of these conflicts between the id and superego happen in childhood, and childhood is the era in a human's life that is replete with shock, horror, fear, and disgust. These are of a universal kind that later on shapes humanity as we know it. More specifically, and more pertinent to our conversation, Freud spoke of the ways in which these conflicts within the unconscious are sublimated, or that is, eased or resolved. Freud mentions, of course, that these conflicts can come out as neurotic behavior, nightmares, jokes, slips of the tongue, but most importantly, he mentions creativity, and creativity as expressed through myths, folklore, and literature, all of which are modes of storytelling that children are exposed to since a young age. While he never mentions horror stories per se as important to children, and while most of his focus was of a gross, sexual, and extremely problematic kind, Freud mentioning storytelling as the important sublimation of neurosis and psychological conflicts in kids is something that I, believe it or not, actually agree with. More specifically, I agree with the way it was later interpreted and used to justify the literary taste and needs of children. You see, many years later, a Freudian psychoanalyst refocused a lot of these Freudian theories and utilized them to analyze children's literature specifically. And his assertions and defenses on children's need for magic and scares were so deeply moving and illuminating to me that I must include them in this discussion. That man was Bruno Bettelheim, and his research is contained in his book, The Uses of Enchantment. This book is essentially a mounted defense for children's need for fairy tales. And while not speaking specifically about horror, we all know very well that folk tales and fairy tales, even those, or actually especially those for children, tend to be more gruesome and horrific than anything Stephen King could ever imagine. During the time that Bettelheim was conducting his research, there were many heated debates going on in Europe centered around what's most useful, healthy, and benign for children to read. And many experts and child behavioral psychologists at the time were strongly opposed to the violent and seemingly perverse nature of a lot of fairy tales supposedly written for children. Bettelheim, however, not only defended children reading fairy tales, but actually made the claim that reading such stories is an essential part of childhood. In essence, while Bettelheim also discusses the didactic uses of horror that I mentioned previously, beyond being didactic, Bettelheim explains that horror can be downright therapeutic for a lot of the conundrums that children are faced with while growing up. Bettelheim states that magical and terrifying tales are filled with symbols and psychological processes that are then expressed, explained, and resolved for kids. Of the many examples that Bettelheim offers, my personal favorite is on the subject of folktale characters as archetypal doubles for children's parents. As we know, parents often get angry at children, they scold them, they can act as villains and even as scary monsters, but they can also be sweet, caring, comforting, and nurturing, sometimes even on the same breath. Bettelheim analyzes how the archetypes of the evil stepmother, of the villainous witch, are often parallel with the savior fairy godmother because they are often similar or in close proximity within the fairy tale. Therefore, children are able to pick up on these symbols and archetypes and relate them to their real-life situation in order to come to terms with so many of the problems and fears that revolve around their own interpersonal relationships. Sometimes mom can be the evil stepmother, but she can also be the nice fairy godmother. And through stories, a child can therapeutically accept and be at peace with this fact. So too in a lot of horror, especially that which is aimed at children, there seems to be a major focus on parents, or the lack thereof. And I'm thinking of things like Coraline, Hocus Pocus, or The Witches. Parents are often absent, uncaring, neglectful, inept, or downright evil in these stories. And that in fact just extends to adults in general who are often at odds with children. While contained within a fictitious narrative, these are certainly prevalent topics in a lot of children's lives, which can be a lot for them to grapple with. Therefore, I am in full agreement with Bettelheim that the magic and horror of a lot of children's tales helps to sublimate the many horrors that are lived throughout all of our childhoods. Perhaps horror doesn't necessarily have to be didactic or moralistic in order to make sense or be beneficial for a child, and there have indeed been many critics of children's literature, such as Maria Tatar, who have actually been opposed to the need for children's stories to contain morals. Tatar explains that the subject matter of a story proves enough for a child to be able to draw meaning from it without having to be moralistic or preachy. Especially in horror, with a lot of the monsters and violence, you wouldn't think that a child is actually learning anything from it except how to kill or be evil. And this is why there is so much moral panic around children watching horror. However, children are intelligent, downright philosophical at times, and to think that children can't engage critically with horror and scary stories is sometimes downright insulting to their intelligence. To quote Bettelheim, "The fairy tale proceeds in a manner which conforms to the way a child thinks and experiences the world. This is why the fairy tale is so convincing to them. They can gain much better solace from a fairy tale than they can from an effort to comfort them based on adult reasoning and viewpoints. A child trusts what the fairy tale story tells because the worldview accords with their own." Bettelheim is essentially saying that adults can only count on adult tools to try and educate and comfort children. When we hear about a child's problems, we tend to dismiss them as insignificant, their fears as irrational, because to our adult mindsets, they are. And this is also often a big plot point in scary stories. I mean, how many times have you seen in a horror movie, the kid sees the monster lurking in the basement, and then the parent doesn't believe them? But to a child, their own fear is extremely real. Therefore, horror stories serve as an incredibly useful therapeutic tool, for they allow a child to come face to face with their pressing concerns For horror stories believe children wholeheartedly and affirm their fears. In horror stories, as in a child's mind, monsters are real. The supernatural is real. Fantastic dangers are real. Horror stories provide the tools for a child to confront these fears, to evade them, and to relieve oneself from them. To a child, perhaps, a horror story is the only companion who believes them and who provides help on how to remedy their fear. Okay, that's probably a lot to take in, which is becoming the usual way things are in this channel, so I apologize, and as always, I hope I made sense. But as I stated earlier, this is the adult's perspective on why children might enjoy or find horror useful. That's all nice and everything, and it was nice reading a lot of literature that actually defends the need for children to have magic and horror in their storytelling. However, this is all from the adults. But what about children? What do they have to say about their own tastes and needs? Unfortunately, I cannot place myself into some kind of atavistic hypnosis and regress to my childhood self and answer the question, and any observation that I might have about my own childhood tastes will unfortunately be tainted by the adulthood lens through which I am doomed to forever look back upon. Indeed, it seemed the only resolution was to talk to children themselves. So the only child I was able to interview was my 11-year-old niece, who I mentioned earlier is obsessed with horror movies, creepypastas, etc. And as I ran through the questionnaire that I prepared for her and listened to her answers, her insights were intriguing. So let me just run you through the raw data that I gathered. So first I asked her, why do you like horror? And she answered, I don't know. Then I asked her, do you have friends who like horror? And she said, yes. Then I asked her, why do they like horror? And she answered, I don't know. Then I asked her, do you think kids should watch horror movies? And she answered, if they want. Then I asked her, do you think parents should allow children to watch horror movies? And she said, yes. Then I was kind of losing my patience because I wasn't getting anywhere. So I kind of pressed on and asked, can you think really hard about why you like horror? And ultimately, after thinking on it for a while, she answered, because it's fun. So lacking in any other answer, I'm just going to take this statement from her and run with it. But really, do we need any other explanation as to why children love horror? In many ways, I agree with her wholeheartedly. As a horror fan myself, yes, horror can be tons of fun. And why should we deny that children love horror for the same reasons we do? Now, granted, there is a lot in horror that I agree is just not appropriate for children. There are some stories and films that are just too graphic, both violently and sexually, and that children should just not be left alone to cope with. I feel like that's easy to understand and that's self-explanatory, and certainly I wouldn't want my niece reading any of the books that I've talked about in this channel. But let me tell you a little anecdote of mine. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I took my nephew and niece to watch It. And within the first few minutes of the film, Pennywise bites a kid's arm clean off. And you see the blood, you see the armless kid crawling around and crawling in pain. And yes, very spooky stuff and maybe a little bit too much for children. I was genuinely concerned at that moment about what my young company were watching, and yet they seemed thoroughly unfazed by it. My nephew, being a little bit older, he was like, oh, well, I understand it's not real. It's just a movie. My niece actually covered her eyes when it happened. And she also covered her eyes when things got too scary. But otherwise, she enjoyed the rest of the movie just fine. So I'm telling you, kids can be much more mature about things than we give them credit for. Now, I am by no means a child behavioral psychology expert. And of course, my experience shouldn't be taken as universal. Kids and their tolerance for horror varies from person to person. But as author Kevin Scott puts it, kids are their own best censor. If a kid finds a book too scary, they're likely to close it and pick up something else, coming back to the offending tale when they're ready. And what a great opportunity to discuss what scares them and how to judge situations they'll face later in life. If a movie or book is too much for a kid, on most occasions, believe me, you will know. And kids will not just sit through something they don't find enjoyable. A lot of kids are adept at gauging their own taste and at refining it. and to know what's comfortable and fun for them. As I learned from my niece, who knows when to shield her eyes or walk away from something she doesn't like. And I actually think that these behaviors of protesting and expressing her distaste, which she learned from watching scary movies, are actually invaluable for other situations that she might face later in life. Horror is fun for children because they know how to make it fun for themselves. Now, Allan Schwartz, a licensed clinical social worker, explains, "Frankly, we love to be scared in the safety and warmth of our homes or in the safety of movie theaters, all huddled together with other children, teenagers, and couples. After all, what's Halloween really about? I do not recommend that children between the ages of 2 to roughly 10 years of age should be exposed to this because they are not yet mature enough to handle what seems to them like real blood and gore on the movie screen. I wouldn't make a regular diet of it. After that, I see no harm in an occasional horror movie and actually believe it's helpful because it discharges a lot of our darkest childhood fears, but in ways that are safe and helpful." So, there you have it. Don't take my word for it. There's an expert on children, and those are his words. Now here he mentions safety and helpfulness. And we've discussed all about this helpfulness before, but I do like what Dr. Schwartz mentions in regards to safety. Horror within media is fun for children because of how safe it is, while simultaneously being daring and exciting. Just think of what the nature behind the roller coaster ride is, and suddenly children enjoying horror might not be as strange or off-putting anymore. It's all about that thrill, that exhilaration, the same reasons why a lot of adults enjoy horror as well. It's always a delight to me that often what follows my nephew or niece being jolted by a monster or jump scare is their immediate laughter after the fact. To be able to experience fear and excitement so comfortably is definitely a privilege and actually helps a lot of children become braver and more daring. There is a sense of pride when my niece is able to finish a horror movie or when she reads scary story after scary story and then proclaims, "That wasn't even scary." I myself was always terrified of horror movies as a kid, but the more I watched them, the more I was able to handle them until I was fully desensitized from on-screen terrors and was able to just enjoy the movies for what they were. This might just be the adult in me talking, but I'm willing to bet the safety of watching a horror movie is what helped me overcome a lot of my childhood fears. There's something about horror being contained on the screen or in a book that sort of helps us rationalize and explain away what would otherwise remain just scary, unexplainable stuff. And honestly, what else can I say? With safety and proper precautions, children tend to have a ton of fun with horror, and who are we really to deny them of that healthy exploration of the subject matter? Children just love horror, people. They just do. They always have, they always will. You know, they'll be fine. I know there's a million concerns, a million questions, a million outrages, but at the end of the day, children know what they love, and they'll continue to love it. To quote some tried but wise words, the kids are all right. In order to conclude this video, I want to return to this question of innocence and childhood, and this time direct my words to any parents or young ones who may be watching. While doing research for this video, I came across a piece by novelist and critic Marina titled "Little Angels, Little Monsters, Keeping Childhood Innocent." What Warner essentially uncovers in this piece are the negative effects of so stubbornly and vehemently attempting to preserve our own definitions and projections of innocence in regard to children, and I found her insights particularly salient to this discussion of children loving horror and why it may seem so jarring and inappropriate to a lot of adults. As I discussed before, children and horror seem to be polar opposites, one innocent, the other perverse and corrupted. However, I hope that my discussion has somehow persuaded you that this is not necessarily the case. In fact, in these closing words, I hope to convince you that, in fact, it may be the constraining and oppressive prejudices and convictions around innocence that may ultimately result harmful to children. In her piece, Marina brings up an incredibly tragic moment in history centering around children, horror, and violence. Warner introduces this concept of a utopian childhood state, an endless fascination that adults project onto children as them being innocent, one-dimensional, pure creatures who symbolize all that is good and can do no wrong. In contrast, Warner then talks about the abduction and murder of James Bulger. For those of you who don't know, James Bulger was a 2-year-old toddler who was abducted and killed by two 10-year-old boys in Britain in 1993. I will spare you all the gruesome and upsetting details of this case because it is truly an awful and terrible story, but Warner calls our attention specifically to the age of the victim and the age of the perpetrators. As we can tell, both were children. The perpetrators were older, certainly, but by all definitions, we would not hesitate to call 10-year-olds children. When the perpetrators were revealed to the public, however, their age made little difference in the indignant eyes of the raging masses. Here is how Warner describes the ordeal. The shock of James Bulger's death was deepened by his murderers' ages, yet their trial revealed a brutal absence of pity for them as children. It was conducted as if they were adults, not because they had behaved with adult consciousness, but because they had betrayed an abstract myth about children's proper childlikeness. Of course, horror movies were one of the first things that adults attempted to blame, specifically child's play, which early unsubstantiated claims stated was a favorite of one of the perpetrators, reigniting campaigns against the aforementioned video nasties. However, this was later disproven, and the perpetrators had actually never even seen the film, and nothing at all suggested that they were fans of horror. So with nothing left to blame, no other court procedure to conjure up, no sufficient amount of therapy or resources available, the children were simply tried and convicted as adults, and the public continued to look at these children as evil, foul monsters. As Warner describes, it led to a dissolution, punitive and callous, with the young as people. What Warner is doing here is dissecting the ambivalence that adults have towards children. Adults revered James Bulger as an angel because he remained pure until the moment of his death, yet the killers, even if they were also children, were reviled because they failed to uphold their role of innocence. What I see here above all is that we as a society are truly highly unequipped to understand and help children. We seem to only have the resources and training, and above all, we only seem to have the compassion and patience to deal with children who fit into our definitions of innocence, and anything that strays too far from that is suddenly a problem. I see this discussion as being especially important for children in horror because, as I've stated, a lot of parents seem to view children liking horror as a problem that needs to be corrected. If a kid likes horror movies, we're inclined to perceive these kids as violent, erratic, or deviant, even if they're just children. If a kid plays violent video games, suddenly we need to investigate, correct, admonish, and punish. So much of parenting, not just at a personal level, but at a societal one, seems to just be adults trying to cram children into the safe zone of childhood and what's innocent, rather than attempt to expand our definition of what childhood truly is. The thing that a tragic and horrifying case, as was the murder of James Bulger, truly reveals is that, of course, while not all children are murderers or evil, the truth is, we really do not know everything about children and their behavior, and we really don't fully understand what childhood is all about. And certainly sticking to our guns of what innocence and childhood should be isn't going to get us anywhere. Therefore, parents, if your kid likes horror, don't automatically view it as a problem. Don't try and correct it, don't try and restrain them, and certainly please don't view your kid as erratic, as a troublemaker, or as being wrong. Instead, talk to your children, damn it. See what they have to say about why they love horror. Try to understand why it has a resonance with them, why they seek it out, and how in turn you can turn this into a positive experience. Children liking horror is not abnormal. We simply need to condition ourselves to understand what's normal to a child and why that is so. Well, I certainly did not expect this to turn into family therapy, but I do think it's an important way to conclude this conversation around horror and children, because ultimately children should be the final say on the matter. So if any of you have any children in your life who are starting to be interested in spooky, scary things, try and see what they have to say on the matter. Why do they like it? Talk to them about it. Who knows? Maybe you can bond over it. The family that's scared together stays together, or whatever. I don't know. I don't know how to end this video. I guess I'll just see you next time. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. And again, give it a like, subscribe, all that good stuff. And I will see you whenever I put out something else.